we see these very, very high rates of things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity, we tend to individualize and personalize that. We look at people who have these conditions and say, well, they probably were eating wrong, whatever the cause, whether or not they had control or access, we think of that as an individual level. But there's a lot of new research in a field that's sometimes called the developmental origins of health and disease, DOHAD. There was just a big international conference here in Portland on that last month, bringing together a lot of medical researchers in that field, also called epigenetics, so looking at things that happen on top of our DNA level, right? Did you get the fat gene or not? We used to talk about that, but now in the biomedical research community, we're recognizing it's not just the genes that you inherit and acquire, but it's the lifestyle factors, or a large part of that being the diet of your mother during the time of pregnancy and your grandmother, and interestingly and very importantly, also fathers, paternal influence, paternal diet influences their children's and their grandchildren's risk for obesity, for cardiovascular disease, and diabetes and obesity. So all of these situations where there's a liquor store on the corner, McDonald's, poor food choices and availability are having impacts not just on this generation and at the individual level, but on subsequent generations as well. And of course, the kind of food injustices that we see often follow lines of race and social class and those kinds of divisions in society. So food justice is not just about us as individuals, it's not just about today's communities, but it's about injustices that are perpetuated throughout generations and that start to look maybe natural or normal, or like maybe there's some gene involved when it's something that's really epigenetic on top of the gene and being influenced by diet. And I guess the silver lining to that is that our genes are very much fixed, and we talk and hope about gene therapy, but epigenetics is responsive to environmental changes. So those changes that do get passed down from generation to generation can be erased and changed and fixed by improvements. So that's a very compelling argument for working hard to change these disparities and these food injustices and correct those, because it's going to have an effect on future generations, and you can tie that to all kinds of things that are in important political dialogues and discourses right now, economic profitability of subsequent generations, and healthcare costs and all of that go beyond the individual level as well. So I think that that's an exciting new area of research. There's a parallel in the tobacco cases where the tobacco industry was saying, well, maybe it's something about these people that smoke. It's not really the tobacco that's causing lung cancer. It's other factors, or there's big socioeconomic disparities. It's not really the tobacco smoke. But when researchers were able to identify the compound benzopyrene adduct compound from the tobacco smoke bound on top of the DNA at the site, the gene that was involved in lung cancer, you could see that something on top of the gene was influencing it. It wasn't an individual level. That was when tobacco legislation shifted and policy shifted. So I'm hopeful that more of this message can get out. Time magazine had an article, cover story last year. It's not in your genes, and shifting this discourse that things are fixed at the individual level, and that there's food injustices, but that might not impact future generations, and get that message out that there is an impact that traces through generations, and that we need to erase those food injustices now. And the other big point I would make that I've been thinking about a lot, and I know Mark Bittman has written about this in the New York Times, but the parallels between the Occupy Wall Street and now, of course, Occupy Portland, the broader Occupy movements and food injustice. So they're obviously intricately tied, because where do so many of our food injustices come from? This idea of profitability from food, which is something essential, biological. We can't live without food, right? So where do we draw the line? Trade in food as a commodity, that probably has very, very deep cultural, long-standing roots. People have traded foods between groups and populations for a long time. But where does it start to become really highly unethical to be profiting from food to such an extent and to such a degree and in such a manner, the kinds of foods that are generating this profit? I mean, we have an outcry, melamine in baby formula, that is something unethical, right? But that's ultimately profiting from food. Where do we draw that line? Is it unethical to be having trans fats? The fact that so much soy and corn that's grown in a way that's completely environmentally unsustainable then gets passed down and profited from, being funneled into food in lower income communities. Where do we draw the line between, substituting melamine, which is a profit move, and substituting corn and soy derivatives and making that the main part of a diet for organisms, humans, that were never made to eat that kind of diet, and that then go back and feed into these social injustices. So I think it's interesting if you look at a lot of the Arab Spring movements, what preceded a lot of them was pressure on food systems and food insecurity and rising costs of food and unavailability of food. And so there's a tight link there that we need to really address, and to tie these kinds of Occupy movements in with food, both from starting food as a starting point and from the corporate control position as a starting point. Those two meet in these kinds of food injustices. So I think making sure that food is a central piece of these movements is important as well.